Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Pete, and I was looking at the 2301 U.S. Federal Government Study Guide 1. And so I wanted to go over the study guide as kind of like a way of walking through a discussion about these things with the Penny University concept. And the main focus is about American government, obviously, United States government, and some of the ways it developed. And so we've got to make it clear to start, right, that a lot of people, even in some of the reading, talks about democracy and how we have a democratic system, and that's not entirely the way one would describe it, right? It's really there's a difference between democracy and a democratic republic, or say a republic with democratic principles, right? So one could sit there and look at this and say, well, the United States has a democracy, right? And one would say, okay, well, go to the Constitution and find the word democracy. And I always try to emphasize this in the live lectures, is that oftentimes people don't realize that the word is not used in the Constitution. And part of that is the fear that the founding fathers had with the concept of democracy. I mean, you can go Google or AI check as much as you want, but basically, you have, you know, President Madison, James Madison, talking about the limits of democracies, right? And Alexander Hamilton saying, "Hey, we have Republican form of government," not meaning Republican Party or Democratic Party, but Republican meaning a form of government, right? Of representatives, and we elect them and things like that. Um, he talks about the protection of liberties and extremes of democracy. A lot of times, despotism or say dictatorship and democracy are seen as the same thing, right? Because at least with a dictator, a king, you can eliminate that, right? You can go after that person. In a democracy, there's this appearance that, well, we're elected. There's some legitimacy of power, but there's a tyranny that comes with it. Meaning, we look legitimate, so now we can make rules about everything else. And there's interesting, videos like with Milton Friedman, noted economist and Nobel Prize winner, talks about how, we don't want to ever have it where you get 51% of the vote so you can eliminate the other 49%, right? And that's why democracy tends to fail and eat itself. Now, John Adams talks about that. Democracy is not lasting that long. Ben Franklin talks about the risk of people figuring out that they can vote themselves money, and that's the end of the republic. Um, and then there's also Washington talks to a point about this, right? About the fear of democracy. So what's important to take away from this is that there are democratic principles in our constitutional republic, right? So, for example, we may vote for elected officials, U.S. representatives, U.S. senators, even the presidents. But there's this concept of we don't want that power to be concentrated too much. So the founders said, hey, here's some concepts that we've learned not only from Aristotle, but like Aristotle believed in a constitutional type republic where there's a dictator, king, if you will, philosopher king of some sorts. And then there's this like Senate, so to speak, or this legislative body. And we see that from the history of England. Like they can talk about, well, there's John Locke and Hobbes and all these noted enlightened thinkers, and they did have their impact. But one of the bigger impacts was the role of the British Parliament, right? And while the American system is like, we don't like this king monarch thing, right? We want of the people. Power doesn't derive from a monarch or government. But we do like the way this system works. Like there's people elected, they represent, and they have, people have input, and they can have lengths of tenure and time, and they can be removed and replaced, and so there's all this checks on power and all that. So there was a lot of the British Parliament influence on the U.S. system. Part of that too is that there is this check to say, look, we have a written constitution, which is different from the British system. And we also want to have a division of power that's more effective. For example, the British system has a fusion of the prime minister, meaning like say a president, if you will, what we have, with a parliament when we have the Congress, the Senate, and the House, and those powers are fused in the British system, whereas in the U.S. system we split them off. The courts are also very independent, and they in the United States system, and that is another split of power, right? So not only is the federal government split with the executive, the judicial, and the legislative, but the legislative is further broken down into the House and the Senate, right? And so that can really break things down even more. Now, the founding fathers looked a lot of things about trying to say, um, how do we remove political influence like parties? They were under the kind of like a fantasy that political parties wouldn't have a role. There wouldn't be political parties. Even George Washington was like, "Oh yeah, there's no parties. This is all going to go great. You know, we're all going to represent the institution that we're elected to or appointed to." Right? That was the concept. Unfortunately, maybe Washington pulled that off, even though he was technically a federalist, meaning a little bit more focused on the federal government, a larger federal government, say the anti-federalists. That would be more like the Jefferson group and the Virginia crowd overall, like Madison and all that. So there was from day one, Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Now they may not be the political parties that we see today, but they were there. Okay, and so Washington kind of rose above that, even though he was technically labeled a Federalist. One would argue he could have said he was anything, and he would have been elected. Okay, I always note that he's the only president to ever receive all the electoral college votes in an election, and he did it twice. Okay, so that's very, very important that we had that unifying figure at the beginning because instead of being a king, which he was offered, he wanted to be a president. And he served 2 terms, saying that's plenty of time. And that's where the precedent is set for 2 term limits of presidents. Okay, so while it's important to look at the study guide and kind of understand, okay, there's the ancient Athenians and the Greeks and here's some of the political philosophies and all that. Those are very important things to read because a lot of these philosophers had impact upon our system, meaning the U.S. system, and how we see things and why we divide power and all that. The founders even went one step further with dividing power to ensure that it wasn't concentrated. And they said, hey, what we're going to do is go even one step further and say not only is the federal government power um, split up in the federal government, but also between the states, right? So states have a certain level of like retained powers, if you will, and the federal government has its role as well. So power split even further, and then within each state, typically the states as they did things, they kind of mirror a lot of the federal government. Like there's a legislative, some type of executive and judicial branches, and they kind of have their own all checks and balances and things like that. So we have to kind of remember that power is even split up more that way in order to really check all that concentration of power, which leads to abuse of power and corruption and things like that. So we have to kind of put those things in perspective too, and how those things check and all this is designed to do in federalism. The concept of federalism is to break up power, have enough power in the system to do things when it is necessary, but not too much that abuses our rights. So that goes back to 2 different things. Is one interesting note, and this is kind of like a nerd history, is the states were there first and they created the federal government. It was a necessary evil. They chained the federal government down with the Constitution, but the federal government was second. Okay. And why that's important is as much as the Constitution was developed by the founding fathers and some of the most brilliant minds that America had ever, or even the world had ever seen, right? Having said that, a lot of emphasis was placed on by the founding fathers on the state constitutions because that's where the power was. That's where they believed the history was, the focus, the importance. Okay. And the federal government was, yeah, it's important, but that's why there's some gaps in it. Like the judicial branch isn't really talked about a lot, and there's some little gaps here and there on certain things. And like the electoral college wasn't fully fleshed out, and the ideas of electorates. So you have to kind of put things in perspective that way, right? Is that there's that whole, the secondary thought and trying to get all those things done that way. The other side of the coin is that when the founding fathers looked at setting this government up, initially they had started with this like consensus form, the Articles of Confederation, which was consensus meaning everyone has to agree to things. So that was very limited with power, taxation, a weak president, all these things that really didn't work. It looked good on paper, right? But it didn't really work overall. It wasn't effective. It wasn't enough power to do much. So it left the new, not United States, but basically America, it left it weaker than it could have been. It could have been a lot stronger. So that's when the Constitution was like, look, we got to put a little bit more power in there, but not too much as to abuse our rights and all that. And the reason rights are important is they don't talk about this as much in some of the reading, but the rights, again, do not come from government or the Constitution or documents. They come from a higher power, the providence, as a lot of founding fathers would say, God, just to be blunt with it, and that those rights come natural. They're natural rights. Natural law takes over, and so we don't talk about that a lot in the readings, but natural law was something that was really influential with the founding fathers, believing that there were things in nature, but mainly saying God, providence, higher powers, and that there was this belief that these things had to be protected because government is what the problem is, right? People are what the problem. They will abuse power if given too much, and they saw that from the King of England, different types of other royalties throughout Europe, other forms of government throughout the world, right? And mainly dictatorships, okay? So that's why you see a lot of this stuff and some of the stuff you got to kind of be aware of in order to get a fuller picture of how things developed in the U.S. system. Um, Going through here again, there's a lot of readings and a lot of little videos and things like that, and podcasts. They put a lot of that in here. One thing that pops up that's always interesting is political spectrum, is how things work from extreme left and right wing. In the picture, it's linear, meaning a line from left to right. But in reality, one could actually say it's like almost like a horseshoe or like a almost complete circle, right? To tell me the difference between uh, like say a far left, far right would be very difficult. They have dictatorships. It even says here terror, force, controlled participation, limited or no political participation. So they're very, very similar. They have different ways of getting there, right? But they're very similar in how they work. Oftentimes, too, people talk, well, you have communism on the left and Nazism, if you will, on the right, but really Nazism is a left-wing ideology, and a lot of people miss that because of some of the differences. And there was this a real movement by the Communist Party saying, "Oh no, the Nazis are on the right side. We don't like them." And really, nobody likes the Nazis, right? That's why everyone attacked and destroyed them and all that. But the communists positioned themselves to be different. Like oh look, there's a difference between us. And really, to be honest, there would be they're from the same branch on the left, meaning liberal type concepts and ideologies, but they did a very good marketing move by pretending like it was different. Okay, so, but my main point here is when you look at this line in your mind, bend it like to an incomplete circle. They're not the same. There is a little bit of a difference between them, so that's why there's a break there. But look at it more like a circle or at least a horseshoe at minimum, right? Or and that would give you a very clear idea. Now, the wording somewhat is there, right? It kind of explains the sides, but you've got to really understand that what the difference between the two extremes are, meaning very little difference. And there's a little bit of reading on that as well. There's a chart, political ideology chart, and kind of goes through all that as well. I don't really emphasize that as much because I'm here to teach government political science, and I don't really want to get into the whole political side of it. Now, if you want to get better at it, right, and you can go have political debates and discussions and arguments, that's wonderful, but that's not here. But having said that, there is some comments that are made in this, like for example, 250 years U.S. Constitution has been amazingly resilient, and that is a good point. Is that the founders were able to create a system that was very resilient, that could change over time and adapt and could be amended. Because that was one of the problems was how do you amend the Constitution? Like there's core concepts we want to keep, right? The institutions of government, the voting, the rights, all that, but there are things that we probably need to change over time. For example, there used to be the voting pattern where the founding fathers had designed the electoral college system, and one of the elections between Adams and Jefferson was Jefferson had clearly won the election. But the problem was his Burr was his VP, and someone didn't get the memo, meaning an elector didn't get the memo to pull one of the votes. And so by not pulling that vote, both of them were technically elected as president. Like they got the well, not elected, but they were identified as the president of the United States. The first person coming in was the president. The second electoral vote would be the vice president. So technically it could cross parties too, right? But electorates were very clear, like, okay, if Jefferson were to receive 74, then Burr should get 72, or just less than, more than Adams, but less than Jefferson, and that's how the president, vice president was done. Well, once that happened, it triggered the constitutional mechanism to send the election to the House, right? And that created its own problem. So whenever this happens, the president is picked by the House, meaning delegations. Each state has a delegate or a delegation, and they have to vote together. So in the United States, for example, we'd have 50 votes, if you will, with 50 states, and then the Senate picks the vice president, and that's one for one vote, meaning that each senator has their own vote, no matter that there are two in each state, right? So they got the vote for the vice president. But because the House was controlled by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists had won, they were trying to jam everything up, and nobody could come to an agreement. Eventually, good people came together and said, "Look, this is just the right thing to do, and we got to fix this," and avoided a constitutional crisis. But the founders also knew we got to fix this. So that was a quick amendment that was put through. And that's an example of where the system was designed to react to things like this in order to fix things or to make things better if enough people came together to believe that, right? The system also, the US system was designed to work when necessary, but really, to be honest, if it wasn't functional, that'd be okay too, right? In other words, we want people to come together to get work done, like budgets and maybe some initiatives or work, but the founding fathers did not want this to be too efficient because then liberties and rights and power would start getting distorted, right? Liberty would go down, power of government goes up, taxation goes up, regulations go up, and they wanted that to be limited and controlled. So if you were to say, "Oh, the federal government was shut down or locked up and all that," founders probably wouldn't be overly upset about that, right? So the main thing to talk about with these things with the federal government is to understand what this study guide is really talking about is understand the context of how the founding fathers put things together. Oftentimes, people take today's concepts and morals and they try to put them backwards. Okay, and that's all fine and good. That's nice to be critical and obviously, we have a lot of smart people today, but they also did not live in that time period. There were differences in gender roles. There were differences in racial interactions. There were differences with power and how people perceive that with kings and and regular people, if you will, and elected officials. There was a lot of differences in all these things that were in play, right? You also understand that the United States was a newly developing area. It had colonies and it came from a monarchy, or if you will, a not so democratic system, right? And one of the advantages we had in the United States is that we were able to develop largely in part of geographic considerations, meaning there wasn't the internet, there wasn't email, there wasn't phones and telegraphs and satellites and all this advanced communication. Communication was limited. It was on ships, and that took time. And so if something happened, it could take months for England and the government to find out about something. And then of course, then that takes time to prepare and then months to get back, right? So you could have very big delays in things. So what's happening on the ground at that time can be changing very quickly, and the host, or if you will, the mother country would not be able to react quickly to it. So one of the advantage was geographically, the United States was isolated, relatively speaking, to Europe. Asia had no influence on this. South America, basically nothing. But Europe, which was the dominating, forces and nations and kings and monarchs, they had a lot more influence, but they were limited by geographics and technology, right? So there's all that going on too. Okay. Also, too, when we went through a revolution, look at the weather. I mean, a lot of people overlook these basic things. Had we not had record snows and record winters, we may not have made it because the British Army would stop during the winter, right? They would quarter. This the reason we have the quartering amendment in the Constitution, that we don't have to quarter soldiers. And so that limited their exercises and their military operations, right? So there's all these moving factors, right? Then you got to look at other things like having the right people at the right time. I mean, George Washington, no matter his failings, if you see them or not, he was a great person, right? Henry Lighthorse Lee, which was related to the Robert E. Lee and all them, was talking about Washington being first in war, first in peace, first in our hearts. He was first in the nation. He was a beloved president, okay, a beloved American. And he made his mistakes, right? I mean, some people argue he started the French and Indian War, that he wasn't the best military person. And these are all probably true statements, right? But what it doesn't change is that he was a person who made mistakes, but he did the best he could, and became he won the Revolutionary War. He adapted, evolved. He got the best people around him. He also was, some people refer to as the American Cincinnatus, that he took time to study history enough. He wasn't what you'd say was overly intellectual, but he took time to understand that when Emperor Cincinnatus came to power in Rome, he came to power, he fixed things, and he walked away, went back to his farms. Washington was very much like that. He could have been a king, he could have been a monarch, he could have been elected for life, and instead he said, "You know what? I'm gonna be a president 4 years at a time." And he he believed in that, and he, because of that greatness, not only winning the Revolutionary War, unifying people, meaning all the founders under like this general concept of government and constitution, all that, and also leading for the first 8 years, that set the tone of excellence, of the standards, of the highest standards and morals. Another fortuitous thing a lot of people don't realize is Washington did not have a bloodline, meaning he did not have a kid. Martha, as wonderful as she was, had her own kid with a previous marriage, but that was not his direct bloodline. Okay. So that created, or let's say, limited the concept of a hierarchy and a hereditary monarchy or positions. Like sometimes we see people today, like their dad or mom was something important, and then the kid gets to inherit that legacy and they kind of take over, or the spouse takes over. You didn't have that issue with Washington. When he died, the line died with him. Okay. And so for right or wrong, right, that was a plus because there was nobody they could say, hey, let's wait for George's kids to get older and then we'll put them in power too, right? We'll use the name to take power, and so that's a big kind of fortuitous or just a good coincidence of situations. So what's important too is understanding how many things had to come together for all these things to happen, right? You had to have the right timing. England was struggling at some points. They started raising taxes, upsetting people, right, and disrupting political arrangements and understandings. There was enough people that had wealth and power and some idea of independence in the United States, which was not a popular concept from the start. It wasn't like everyone woke up and said we want to be a free country. A lot of people struggled with that, and that's another thing that took time to convert enough people to believe that. There were still people during the Revolutionary War that were called Tories that supported the British government and they were Americans in the sense of colonies, right? But they saw themselves as British citizens and they were loyal to the crown, and to the very last day they were still fighting to help the crown win in the colonies. So, that was a fortuitous thing. The weather, like I talked about, the timing of, or the geographics of things. That's very important to understand that. Also, too, the people in place. There's enough intelligent people and people with some level of high integrity. I always talk about, how the Constitution was passed. Imagine this today, right? You get everyone to agree on this Constitution, right? Everything's moving, and say, well, we're not going to pass the first 10 amendments, the rights. We're not going to pass those. Let's pass the Constitution, and then we'll come back and pass those later because we want to show the amendment process. Now think about that for a brief moment, right? I mean, could you imagine people in the federal government going, okay, let's have a gentleman or an agreement to make this work. We'll all disagree. We'll all be professionals and honest, and we'll all just do this right after the fact. I mean, can you imagine that happening? And the answer is really no, you know. But the founders did it because they were men of honor and they had this sacred, belief that there was this natural law and higher powers of providence there, and they were at a moment that they knew it was great. They knew they were creating something larger than themselves. They didn't maybe understand they would be a superpower within a couple hundred years, and maybe they didn't understand what how the world would change dynamically, but they understood they were going to change the world of the colonies, right? They understood that, and then some of them had visions of we're going to go west, manifest destiny west, and all that stuff, and some of them had visions of different things. Hamilton's, those types were very big on that. But having said that, I think the founders would have sat there, they just had the right people at the right time, and they knew to come together on certain things. So when people go back and are critical of them, it's easy to be critical because it's easy to sit there from my chair and say, well, they could have done this, they could have done that. Well, yeah, that's fine. But when you're fighting the world's largest empire, right, the world's greatest military, both on the army side, if you will, ground troops, and also naval power in the world, and you're kind of a not so developed area, you have some things going for you, but not everything, right? The really main thing is weather and geography, and you still have internal strife and all that. And here you are fighting that. You finally get over that, and then you got to try to bring all these people to, that wanted independence. Now you say, hey, okay, we got independence, but we got to bring it under some form of government, and we got to shift gears and do that. And then we got to bring people that had true differences, like even in the slavery issue. Some believed in slavery, some believed not. So then you got to say, okay, how do we write this to bring everyone together? And so how do we put the poison pill to try to, get rid of slavery at some point? So there's all these little moving parts, and yeah, this is very, very complex, right? So what I would suggest to people, so as to not drag this out too long, is when reading this stuff, it's hard to put ourselves in that time. But when you start thinking, okay, technology is different, geography is different, weather was different. They had less, overall, only a certain group of people, the founders, were highly educated, right? There was different levels of morality then, right? There was different levels of integrity and honor, and these concepts were very real at that time. Okay, and so when we look at all those things and we put all these things in perspective and we try to go back and go, okay, I kind of understand because this chapter is all about that, like trying to understand how we got where we were. Okay, then it starts making a lot more sense. So. And also too, it's not just like my opinion. Go read some biographies on some of the founding fathers, some of the early history that's out there. You can watch YouTube clips, videos, that's out there, or whatever, media that you use. But I think one thing important to do is kind of avoid strong isms or modernism where they take things and try to explain how it could have all been better back then. If I waved magic wand, everything could be better, right? Or if I lived in a fantasy world, everything could be better. But this was the real world at the time. And looking at not having a lot of good examples of successful democracies, that's another challenge that the founders had. You have to always put these things in some context, right? And that helps you to understand more of what's going on here. And so if we say, well, why does the government look like this? It's one thing to read this, it's one thing to really understand how it happened, right? So that's really where it's at on this part of the Penny University Unit 1. And what I also want to leave with is if there's ever an idea that needs to be fleshed out, let me know. I'm more than happy to discuss it. I'm just trying to summarize a lot of the concepts that I talk about over the semester and try to really highlight where some of this stuff is coming from. So thank you very much for listening and best of luck.